All right.
Brent, you got the
Terrific.
message. Brent, you got the message. I'll be on the train. I'm going to be switching from one format of listening to another once I get on the train. So just
God,
so you know.
no worries. The challenge with these classes, the biggest challenge is the timing. Once I actually, have the people wanting to learn, I'm good to go. Getting the timing and the tech sorted is the challenge. So we will, those of us who can gather live will gather live, and those who can't will gather on a recording afterward, and we'll take things from there. So, all right, I'm going to jump on into things here, recognizing we're in all sorts of moments of flow. So let me just give a quick reminder of what we talked about last time, and then we're going to jump into things for Pesach, Passover. So last time we were talking first about the spread of Hasidism and how Hasidism started moving through Eastern Europe, providing an accessible way of spiritual fulfillment, meaning, purpose to people's Jewish lives. And it really exploded as people encountered Hasidism and the more immediate, direct, popular framework it offered. It expanded very quickly. So last week we were looking at part of how it understood Shabbat. And part of the framework that Shabbat was in and of itself a day of perfection, which is itself a fairly significant recasting of how many folks, including I imagine many of us, think about or experience the rules around Shabbat, right? Depending what exposure to Shabbat you've had, you might have encountered a lot of you can't, or alternately, you have to. And what we read last week talked about recasting that as it's not that you can't, it's that you don't need to, right? Right now, I thank God it's not that I can't go to the hospital, it's that I don't need to go to the hospital, right? Recognizing, oh, wait a minute, I don't need to go to the hospital. That's great. What a great thing to be able to say on any given day. Um, and saying, right, Shabbat is a little bit of perfection. We don't need to change things. We don't need to change ourselves. We don't need to purchase anything. Who we are, what we have is perfect as it is. So, so far, so good. Great. So, we're going to be talking today about Passover, and particularly about the teachings of the Pri Chaim on Passover. So first, let me just say a little bit about what Passover is, because like Shabbat, it may or may not be familiar. So if Shabbat is easily and by far the most important Jewish holiday, Shabbat is the heartbeat of Jewish life. Regular, consistent, weekly celebration of the perfection of the world as we encounter it is, I think, without any serious disagreement, the most important day on the Jewish calendar, on the Hebrew calendar. Of course, there are the holidays that come once a year that are often of greater prominence, or at least prominence in popular imagination. And at the top of that list is Passover. There's also the fall holidays, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, which we'll get to in a little bit. But now we're going to look at Pesach in part because we are in the lead up to Pesach, Passover. Same holiday, Passover in English, Pesach in Hebrew, is coming up in just a few weeks. And Passover is at the simplest level. Well, actually, let me do this at three levels. On the manifest level, on the level of lived experience, what Passover means is for people who engage with it in all pardon me, in all different ways, a refraining from eating chametz, essentially leavened bread. There are more technicalities around it, but essentially raised bread, the bread that rises, and anything that goes into, we abstain from for the days of the holiday. And affirmatively, so that's something we don't do. Something we do affirmatively is eat matzah, the flat, love to hate it, Hate to love it. Flatbread of Passover. It is famous the world over for its remarkable similarity to cardboard. Though, if you put some cream cheese and lox, or my kids, cream cheese and sprinkles, it carries it along pretty well. So that's on the eating level. Of course, the eating isn't just the eating, particularly on the first two nights of Passover. There are the rituals of the Seder, or the Seder, um, which in Hebrew just means order. And it's a very structured meal, not just in the eating, but in the discussion. And the fundamental obligation of Pesach, of Passover, is Hayav Adam lirot etzmo ke'ilu hu yatsa Mitzrayim. Every person is obligated to see themselves as having come out of Egypt, to see the ways in which we are coming out of our places of bondage, our places of narrowness, our places of constriction, and moving towards, if not necessarily ever actually arriving at, a promised land, a place of expanse, a place of plenty. So that telling of the story, hello, Lori, that telling of the story of the Exodus from Egypt, both in its historical framework, long time ago, there were Israelites, they were slaves in Egypt, they came out, they became free, and also in our own experience. Me, Brent, born in 1975, never been to Egypt, never actually been a slave in the sense of somebody else had control over my bodily autonomy. How do I, Brent, today see myself as if I have come out of Egypt? Where are the places where I am in some way or another enslaved, limited, constricted? And how do I come out into that place of expanse? So, if level one of the holiday is the rituals around not eating chametz, eating Passover, if level two of the holiday is the sort of um, archetypical stories of coming out from bondage into freedom, today we're going to dive in a little deeper onto level three. But before I do that, let me stop there. Thoughts, questions, reactions to just this basic framework of what Passover is about before we go deeper. And really, please, I meant it when I said it. No prior knowledge is necessary. So if there's something you're like, okay, I'm here for all the mystical stuff, but I've just been wondering, what's the deal with this thing? Please, please bring it. Once, two times. All right, we're going to go onward here. But really, I count on you to stop me from rambling endlessly and needlessly. So what we're looking at and I apologize. I'm for folks who missed this. I'm away from home. I'm coming to you from Bethesda, Maryland, where I'm visiting my mother-in-law. So I don't have my printout. I've got my tablet, so I'm not sure what page we're on. But we're in section number two that says Pesach. And we're looking at a teaching from the Pri Chaim, whose full name, which nobody ever uses, is Rav Abraham Chaim ben Gedalia. So something to know about most major rabbis. They're not, if you know you've really made it when you start being referred to just by the name of your book and you basically lose your individual name, right? In American culture, it would be as if we referred to the Moby Dick when we meant Herman Melville, or perhaps the Born to Run when we meant Bruce Springsteen. So I know the Pri Chaim. I've studied the Pri Chaim. In preparing this, I had to go look up his actual name because I've never actually referred to him by his actual name. And in for most of the people who I've learned with in yeshiva, if I used his actual name, they would have no idea who I'm talking about. But if I say, "Oh, we're looking at the Pri Chaim," they know exactly who we're. So now the Pri Chaim was one of the early generation, and this is just a little bit for folks who are interested in the historical development. As is often the case, the innovator and the popularizer were not the same person. In the expansion of Hasidism, the innovator, the person who really had the thoughts or perhaps the feelings would be more accurate, that became Hasidism was known as the Baal Shem Tov, the master of the good name. He really had one primary disciple, the Maggid of Mezrich, the storyteller of Mezrich. The Maggid, as his title, the storyteller, might indicate, he was the popularizer, right? He was the one who brought students together to teach this framework, or really more than teach, lead people through experiencing this framework of Hasidism, of a more heart centered than head centered approach to the divine. So the Pri Chaim was the first generation of students of the Magi. It's a little bit, I don't know if there are any mathematicians here, but heavy duty mathematicians will brag about their Erdős number, because there was a legendary mathematician, Paul Erdős, and if you would and he co-authored many papers. So if you co-authored a paper with Paul Erdős, you had an Erdős number of one. If you co-authored a paper with somebody who co-authored a paper with Erdős, you had an Erdős number of two. If you co-authored a paper with three, right? You can see how this spreads. That metaphor is only helpful if you're a mathematician. But the Hasids are sort of the same way. The first generation of Hasidim, of whom the Pri Chaim is one, are those who learn directly with the Maggid of Mezrich. Then the second generation are the ones who learn from the students of the Maggid of Mezrich, though there's some fluidity there. So his commentary here is is on the Haggadah. So what we're going to be looking at is about the Haggadah, and I'll tell you now, there will be assumptions about understandings of Kabbalah, which I will definitely fill in. There will also be understandings of Passover that I will also fill in. But as I'm going through Passover, you're like, wait a minute, I missed something there. Please, if at any point, but certainly with the particulars of Pesach, of Passover, let me know. All right. So, and again, I feel like, Paula, this is primarily relevant for you, but for anyone, we've got the English up here where it says translation. And then if you just scroll down a little bit, you've got the original text that just says original, which is the actual Hebrew. So if there's any interest in jumping down there, by all means, we can do so. So let's jump in. So the first thing we've got here is actually not a text from the Pri Chaim, but a text from the Haggadah. So first we're going to look at the Haggadah, and then we're going to look at what the Pri Chaim says about this section of the Haggadah. And this comes from a section known as the four children, traditionally the four sons, where there were four children who each one of whom got instructed in a particular way. Passover is actually a really fascinating pedagogical model. One of the frameworks of Passover is that you have to teach each child in his or her own way, right? This is very much not a teach to the test framework. So there is the simple child, the wise child, the wicked child, the silent child, and it is the obligation. It's not bonus points. It is the baseline obligation of the person leading the Seder to communicate to all of these different types in a way that they can understand. So we come to the section of the Haggadah here that says, what does the wise child say? And the wise child says, what are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments that Yud-He Vav-He, our God, has commanded you? Right? So that line right there, that part in quotes, comes right out of Deuteronomy. And this is what you're supposed to tell him. Now, in the Haggadah, actually, let me back up a second, just to that name of God, Yud-He Vav-He. So this is a useful moment to remember that that Judaism was not created in English. Judaism was created in Hebrew and got translated into English. So when you encounter Yud-He Vav-He, what you're actually encountering is a translation of what's called the Tetragrammaton, the unpronounceable four-letter name of God. Yud, He, Vav, and He. You can't pronounce it. It's not. It would be like trying to pronounce A-E-I-O-U. Like it doesn't work as a verbalized thing. It is some mysterious conjugation of the word to be. The probably the best translation of what the name of God is I that was, am, and will be, or something like that. This is not a limits of, I mean, my Hebrew is not perfect. What you're encountering is not the limits of Brent's Hebrew. It is the limits of Hebrew to capture the ineffable nature of God. That four-letter tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, which is unpronounceable, gets rendered in Hebrew as Adonai, which just means my Lord or my master, or Hashem, which just means the name, right? But those, both Adonai and Hashem, are stand ins for the actual name, which we can't pronounce. Now, that actual name we can't pronounce, when Hebrew gets rendered into English, the Yud often becomes a J, which is why in Hebrew, I might refer to myself as a Yehudi, but in English, I refer to myself as a Jew. And if I'm going and traveling and visiting my friends, I might say I am going to Yerushalayim. But in English, I would say I'm going to Jerusalem. Right? Yud He Vav He gets rendered in English as Jehovah. So if you've had anybody knocking at your door talking about being a Jehovah's Witness, you could pedantically correct them and say, actually, you're a witness of Yud He Vav He, which is incorrectly rendered into English as Jehovah. They'll love you for that. So back into our text here. Um, Yud He Vav He, our God, has commanded us with all of these statutes and particulars, right? And the instructions that you're supposed to give your son, the wise son, right? And it's going to be important that this is the wise son, asks, answer him according to all of the practices of Passover, including afikomen. One does not one does not conclude maftirin, the Pesach meal, Passover Seder, with without afikomen. There's a typo on my part. It should say without afikomen. A significant typo on my part. I apologize. Um, uh, so, can I correct that? I'm not going to. There we go. Okay, great. For those of you who are looking on screen, I just corrected. Okay. So far, so good. All right. So now we're going to. Let me explain what afikomen is, if you're not familiar. So, if you've ever been at a seder and somebody has broken the matzah, taken half of it, hid it in a bag, hid it somewhere for the kids to find it, and ransom it back, that's the afikomen, right? It's the dessert, so to speak. But coming back to the seder as an actually quite sophisticated pedagogical model, it's no secret to the rabbis that little kids get bored at seders. So you would hide this, and they had to go find it. And then when they found it, they would bargain with whoever's leading the seder, and conventionally, the person leading the seder, that would be me, at least in my house, has a bag of treats or toys or gizmos that you will then trade with the kids for the afikomen, unless, of course, my brother, who's a criminal defense attorney, is there, in which case he will coach the children through a much more aggressive and sophisticated series of negotiations, in which case I've learned to have a pile of cash on hand because they will not be satisfied with little plastic doodads if my brother gets them. But the essential thing to know here is that you break part of the matzah and the Seder can't be concluded until you get it back from the kids. So now he says, now we've got the Pri Chaim. He says, is this really all of the laws and all of the practices and laws of Passover? This only refers to the end of the meal, the conclusion of the meal, right? So I'm saying, wait a minute. We've been sitting here at the Seder for 4 hours. We've been eating all sorts of weird food. We've been doing all sorts of weird things. And you're saying the only thing I got to tell my kid is about the afikomen? That doesn't make sense. There's a lot more to it than that. So now he's going to, anytime a rabbi starts his comments with a question, you can be sure he's going to come back and answer that question at the end, even if he goes somewhere else to begin. So now he goes into the Siddur of Rabbi Isaac Luria. Who's Isaac Luria, you might ask? So Hasidism is a popularization of Kabbalah. We talked a little bit last time about how Kabbalah was, up until fairly recently, fairly esoteric. You wouldn't learn Kabbalah unless you were a man over the age of 40 who was married and already mastered the Talmud, right? It just wasn't accessible to the vast majority of Jews. That was, in short, the Baal Shem Tov's innovation, taking what had been obscure and popularizing. Rabbi Isaac Luria, often referred to as the Ari Zal. Ari is just his acronym of his names, and Zal means of blessed memory. He was a Kabbalist, an incredibly central Kabbalist. If you've ever been to or heard of the city of Tzfat, or really the village of Tzfat in northern Israel, understood to be a seat of Jewish mysticism, it's a seat of Jewish mysticism because the Arizal lived and taught there. That's not the only reason, but that's a huge reason. And so he, the Pri Chaim in the 18th century, is referring back 200 years to his teacher, who he never met, the Ari, who was teaching in a more Kabbalistic framework. And now our guy, the Pri Chaim, is taking that esoteric teaching and he's about to make it a little more popular. Now, here's what he says. Here's what he, the Pri Chaim, says that he, the Ari, teaches. The word Pesach, which means skipping, refers to the fact that Israel at the Exodus reached the highest state of mind, Gadlut, before going through, hence skipping over the lesser stages, Katnut. Okay. So he's just dropped a major Kabbalistic concept here. Mochin the Katnut and Mochin the Gadlut. Mochin is brain, mind, really. Not brain as in the medical organ, even though they didn't have that really distinction, but better to think of it as mind, the mysterious capacity that allows me to be aware of myself as Brent, and you to be aware of yourself as Melanie, and you to be aware of yourself as Karen, which somehow resides in the organ of the brain, but is larger than it. Mochin the Katnut is small mind. And it's not like we might use it in English as an insult, like he's a small-minded person. It would be more reasonable to translate it as everyday mind, right? Conventional mind, the mind of differentiation, right? I am Brent. I am in this place. You are Melanie. You are in that place. After I leave this place, I will go get into a machine. It will take me to my mother-in-law. We will have dinner, right? I am one person. My mother-in-law is a different person. That's mochin the cotton. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not bad. It's just every day, conventional, right? There's another mindset, mochin de gadlut, literally big mind, but probably more reasonable to translate it as expanded consciousness, in which I am aware that these apparent separations are really just that. They're apparent separations. I am as separate from my mother-in-law as my pinky finger is from my thumb, right? It looks like they're separate over here, right? And I use my mother-in-law deliberately. I love my mother-in-law. I have a great relationship with my mother-in-law, but she is not my life partner, soul partner, deep connection in that way. She's another human being who I love. And she is separate from me as my pinky is from my thumb. Separate, you can move independently, but not really that separate, all part of the same hand. Central Kabbalistic teaching, when we say Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, what we are saying is, which is the central Jewish prayer, what we are saying is, a Kabbalist would translate that into English as, listen, Israel, Adonai, our God, Adonai is unity. Adonai is oneness. Adonai is the awareness that the pinky and the thumb are on the same hand. The Brent and the hazel are the same divinity, right? That's Mokin the Godhood. And that is an expanded consciousness that maybe you touch once or twice in your lifetime. Maybe not, right? It's not a place you stay. It's a place you visit. And it's a place you strive to visit, right? You might think of it like all of my metaphors are single-use metaphors, so don't try to take them too far because they'll fall apart. But if you think about if any of you have ever been runners, right? You have those moments of the runner's high, that moment where you're like, yes, I am a bird. I'm flying. I'm one with the sky. And then you have the other 98% of the time where you're like, okay, if I go for another 200 meters, I will finish the fourth kilometer. And then I've just got another, right? And you're just sort of grinding through it. But you grind through it for those moments of expanse. Mochin the Gadlut, big mind, is what a Kabbalist is searching for. He moves through it through Mochin the Katnut, through all of the everyday stuff in order to achieve that. So far, so good? All right. So now back in our text, what the Pri Chaim is saying, whoa, but check it out. Us here, us everyday people, we have to grind through in order to grind through Mochin de Katnut in order to achieve Mochin de Gadlut. But the Israelites, at the moment they left Egypt, right, at the moment when the sea split and the heavens opened up and God spoke to them, they just jumped directly to Mochin de Gadlut. They had that expanded consciousness, that consciousness that we are all one, we are all expressions of the divine. Part of the magic of that moment is that they left, right, without going through those lesser stages. Yeah, Melanie, it looks like
Can
you've
I
got a.
ask you a question? If
Yes.
they were in that expanded consciousness state, then the Egyptians were no different from the Israelites. So, what was the killing of the Egyptians to them if they could see their oneness with all?
Great question. So there's a. I'm going to answer twice. Once is the chronology of this, right? The death of the Egyptians happened prior to the moment of Sinai, so maybe they hadn't yet reached that moment of expanse, right? But that's not really an answer. The real, I think, a real answer, and one that's very much live today. And in fact, one of my colleagues from the Pardes Institute is teaching class tomorrow. Let me make myself a note. I'll send this around in case it's of interest. Um, this is just so that 3 hours from now, when I send an email, I remember this. Um, how do we think about our enemies, right? Because at one level, right, the pinky and the thumb are the same hand. But sometimes um, the pinky is trying to kill the thumb, or the thumb is trying to kill the pinky, right? And what do we do then? I think one of the real challenges, and I think one of the real challenges for the Jewish people right now, is how do we think about our enemies? How do we think about the people who wish us harm, who are real? They're absolutely a reality in the world, while also recognizing that they too are expressions of the divine, right? And that we have an obligation to the divine here to protect this. But that doesn't mean that the people who are trying to attack us are monsters, are not human, are not other expressions of the divine. And I think that this is a challenge for anybody in war. It is certainly a challenge for the Jewish people now to recall the humanity and even the divinity of those who wish us harm. It is a tall and some might argue impossible level, but I think from a spiritual place, that is what the tradition asks of us. And one last thing, and then we'll jump over to Laurie. I think it's at all moments, the Jewish community has often felt, at least in my lifetime, as if Judaism is the politics of the Jewish people. And we need a politics, we need a state, we need all of the trappings of modern political life for better and for worse, but they are not Torah. They are not Judaism. They are necessary for Judaism. I want to be clear. I'm not arguing. The best I can offer is an analogy. In my house, I have locks on the doors. I have a security system. I have windows that lock. That's not what my home is about. Those are things I need in order to keep my home safe. But my home is about the people who gather there, the meals that are had there, the love that is shared there. And we need a security system. But that's not what it's about. I think in my lifetime, it has been a struggle for Judaism to remember and Jewish leaders to remember that we might need, and I'm not in any way arguing we don't, the trappings of a state, of a military, of weaponry. Those are things we might need and do need, but they're not Judaism. They're not what Judaism is about, even as they might be necessary. Laurie, please.
Hi, everybody. I'm sorry. I listened to the class last week. It's nice to meet like-minded and interesting people. But one has to wonder if perhaps the reason, and this is more political than about Pesach, but one of the reasons that the very ultra-Orthodox do not participate in the military in Israel is because they do see the enemy. They don't see it's not really a question of an enemy. It's a question of letting people be. It's just I never even it never dawned on me until this particular class.
Perhaps. I feel I've got enough trouble figuring out my own soul. The ultra orthodox soul is a step beyond what I can peer into. But yeah, um, those dynamics are there. All right, I'm going to jump back in here because I want to make
Brent,
sure.
can I just ask a
Oh,
question? It's a
yes.
very logical.
Is that Paula?
Yeah, it's much more
Yes,
practical. Um,
please.
is he saying that the Israelites skipped the lower every day and they had this wonderful universal enlightenment? At what point? When they left Egypt, when they were complaining in the desert, when they reached Sinai? Something isn't making sense
Mhm.
to me.
So I'm going to jump down to the Hebrew here. Um, it just refers to Pesach. He doesn't get more specific here. Um, B'Siddur Arizal, lama nikra Pesach lashon dilug, v'kfitza shehi az gdulot kodem v'katan. I think right now we could go back and see if he gets more specific elsewhere, but right now he just means the overall experience. Let's say from the splitting of the sea to Sinai, where exactly, even as earlier I tried to lean on that for the sequence, he's actually not that specific. I was putting words in his. Right. All right, we're going to jump back in here. So, I learned from that holy lamp, Rab Avraham, the son of our teacher, the Magid, right? So Pri Chaim learned from the Magid of Mezrich, also learned from his son. Um, Occasionally, the good rabbis have sons named Abraham, who are also pretty good. Um, and so what he learned from Reb Abraham is that a person needs to repair all of the seven qualities, beginning with love, awe, and glory. Each has to be turned towards the Holy One. So we do not make use of these attributes for our own bodily benefit, but only for the sake of the 49. Each of these qualities contains all seven within it, thus adding up to 49. Only after all of these does the 50th gate, Bina, come to dwell with us. Okay, so lots at play here. What is he talking about with these seven attributes? So you might recall I said that Hasidism is basically a popularization of Kabbalah. So within a Kabbalistic framework, if you scroll or flip pages back, and I apologize, I don't have the page numbers on the screen version here, but you're looking for something that looks like this. Oops. That page. So what this is, and I'll just hold this here for a second for the, which is not the most technologically sophisticated, but what this is the Eitz Chaim. This is the tree of life. These are the sphirot, the elements of the divine. And it's a little more than a little tricky to explain what these are. So these are going to be a bunch of single use metaphors. These are the stages that the divine goes through in its journey from totally ethereal divinity to a God who we can relate to. The best metaphor I can think of, or I've come up with, though it has its limitations, for those of us who live in the Hudson Valley or live by any other large body of water that freezes in the winter, right? At least in the Hudson, and I suspect down here on the Chesapeake as well. If you go down to the river, right, around like December time, the water will be sort of slushy. It won't be totally fluid the way it is in August. Neither will it be rock solid ice the way it'll be, or it might be in January. It's in this intermediate state. The Sphero are sort of 10 stages of water moving from fluid to ice, right? It's a process without actually clear delineation, but you can step back and say, yeah, here it's totally fluid, here it's totally solid, and in between there's this spectrum. The Sphirot are, one way to think about them is different stages of instantiation of divine presence into the world, right? Another way to think about them is as rocks in a waterfall over which the water flows. Similar idea of progression, a little more distinct. You've got one rock, then you've got another rock. What they all have in common is this dynamism, right? In Kabbalistic thought, God isn't a noun, God is a verb. Or maybe a more accurate way of putting that, in Kabbalistic thought, the divine is a verb, which is sometimes expressed as a noun we refer to as God, right? But God is to the divine as ice is to water. A true expression, but not a exhaustive expression, right? When we say water becomes ice, we don't mean it doesn't cease being water. It's also water, right? Ice is also H2O, or maybe that's a better way to put it. God is to the divine as ice is to H2O. A true expression of it, but not the only expression of it, right? Water, right? The stuff in here is also H2O. And if I boiled this and the vapor was coming out, that would also be H2O. But the vapor, the water, and the solid ice, they're all H2O, but they're not exactly the same thing, but they're sort of the same thing. The divine is the H2O. And when we say, please God, let my loved one live, we are talking to one expression of that divine, but that expression is not all of it. There are 10 steps in there, which is really 3 and 7. He's only talking about the lower 7, which is all we're going to talk about right now. These 7 steps by which the divine energy becomes manifest in the world. This was the other big innovation of the Chassids. The Kabbalists saw those 7 steps out there in the ethereal world, in the cosmos. The Chassids said yes, and also in here. The 7 steps by which the divine becomes manifest is out there in the world and is in here in how I talk to my kids, how I talk to my partner, how I talk to my mother-in-law, right? They didn't have the language of psychology, but first and foremost, the Chassids were psychologists before Freud, right? Understanding that in me, I have an element of awe, an element of fear, an element of love, an element of compassion. And at any given moment, one of those or another of those is going to be at the forefront, right? That divinity within me might get expressed or blocked by my own actions and choices, right? So when he's talking about our work is correcting each of those 49, each of those seven, and those seven combine with themselves to become 49. For right now, just trust me that, I mean, you have to trust me. Seven times seven is 49. That's how he's getting to the 49. But that our work is of individual growth, right? When the Hasids talk about coming out of Egypt, they don't think, wow, Paula, you've spent a lot of time on the Suez Canal making bricks, and we've got to get you out of the Suez Canal and stop making bricks. Now I won't use Paula as an example. They're saying, hey, Brent, you might be a little enslaved in your childhood traumas, and those might come out in the sharpness with which you speak to your children. Right? What is the rectification of your elements of mercy? What is the rectification of your elements of structure that you need to engage with in order to reach that 50th level where the divine is right there? Right? A Kabbalist would see me snap at my kids and say, you're pushing the divine away. What do you have to do to invite that in? Or perhaps to let that flow through you more effortlessly, as opposed to building a little beaver dam for that divine energy, which is what you're doing when you're saying, right? That's the Egypt the Hasids are worried about me being trapped in. The Egypt of my sharpness, the Egypt of my impatience, right? Perhaps you're trapped in an Egypt of your gluttony or of your sloth or of any of the other Egypts that plague us, right? When he talks about repairing those seven qualities, he's talking about what we would refer to as personal growth, right? Letting that divine presence move through you unencumbered. So far, so good. Questions, thoughts? Yeah, Karen, please.
Why
Karen, then Melanie.
um, explain, and maybe you don't want to deal with this, but why is the 50th gate the Binah, the womb?
I'm just going to pause your question, Karen, till the next paragraph.
Okay.
Come to Melanie's question here, and then come to yours in the next.
So I got stuck on a little bit of the numbers. If there are 10 Sephiroth, why are we having 7 qualities?
All right. So let me try and pull apart both of these numeric things. First to Melanie's question, which will actually then set up Karen's question. So we've got the 10 Sphirot, but they're divided into 3 upper and 7 lower. The 3 upper ones are Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. If you've ever encountered Chabad are Chasids. Chabad is an acronym for Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. Chabad. Those are the 3 upper Sphirot. With our imperfect analogy, if you imagine a waterfall, or actually, yeah, let's stick with a waterfall. Those 3 rocks of Chokhmah, Bina, and Dot, they're at the very top of the waterfall. If you're at the bottom of the waterfall, you can't even see them. They're like on the river before it goes over. What you see on the face of the waterfall are the 7 lower ones, right? So in the mapping of the divine attributes up there to in here, often those 3 upper ones get, it's not that they're left behind, it's a little bit of like, let's save that for 201. After you've gotten those 7 ones all perfected, right? You know, like, why don't you try jogging 1 kilometer before you sign up for the marathon?
Okay.
You can sign up for a time, but that's a couple
That's
of stages
helpful.
down.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that's why they're the 7. Now, to Karen's question, let's jump into the next paragraph and then see if that helps us. All right. So the 7 becomes the 49. 7 times 7 is 49. But at the Exodus from Egypt, they came immediately to the 50th gate. Scripture says Israel came forth from Egypt, Hamushim, read as 50-fold. So here is some of the rabbinic wordplay. In plain Hebrew, Hamushim means groups of 50, right? It's like roughly equivalent to dozens, right? Except instead of 12, it's 50. The plain reading of scripture would say the Israelites moved in groups of 50, right? If you've ever organized a group of people, first thing you're going to do is break them down into smaller groups so you can manage it. You can't manage 600,000 people. You break them down into smaller groups. You have captains of each one, and that's how they move. The Kabbalists could not be less interested in the plain meaning of the text. They read that not as Hamushim, groups of 50, but as in the element of the 50th, at the place that is one beyond 49. Right? So, Karen, to your question, the rectification of the attributes of the soul, that's one by one getting to 49. But 50 is what's beyond, right? 50 in this instance indicates that which is beyond conventional rendering, conventional understanding, right? It's a little bit akin to why we do Brit Milah on the 8th day. 7 days, get your 7 again. 7 is a full cycle, right? The 7 days of the week, the 7 days of creation. Brit Milah is on the 8th day, indicating that it's something beyond the conventional natural cycle. We're moving into a different realm, right? Just as Brit Milah on the 8th day is one past the 7, so is Hamushim one past the 49, the 7-7, right? The Kabbalists read that indication we're moving in groups of 50 to mean we're moving at a different level. We have kicked it into hyperdrive, right? We're moving at a greater capacity. It was through Bina. Remember I said those top 3, Chokhmah, Bina, and Da'at. Bina is the central of the top 3. That the miracle took place. This miracle, the miracle that they jumped from small mind to big mind. But afterwards, after that moment, that actual moment that none of us were there for, thousands of years ago in Sinai, that enlightenment was taken away from them. And they were commanded to count out the 49 Omer days in which each quality would be specifically addressed. Then on Shavuot, they reached the 50th gate. So too at Exodus, there was Gadlut before Katnu, right? And with 12 minutes left, we're just getting through the introduction here. But don't worry, we're going to get there, right? So this is what he's saying. The days of the Omer are the days in between Passover and the holiday of Shavuot. It's 7 weeks of 7 days. There's your 49 days. On every one of those 49 days, we are commanded to look at one of these attributes in a particular permutation. The 7 times 7 gives you a different permutation on each day. And it is, and I recommend, and I'm happy to talk more, I can send some resources on this, to take on each one of those 49 days an opportunity to elevate parts of our own neshama, parts of our own soul. That is the work of Omer. And I would argue, and I think he would argue as well, that's the work of being a Jew, right? If your Judaism isn't trying to make you a better person, you're missing the point of the exercise, right? Jumping back to our earlier conversation, the point of Judaism is not to have an armor. We might need to have an armor. This is not saying we don't need to have an armor. It's saying the point is not to have an armor. The point is to become a better person, a more capable servant of the divine, right? And that's what we're supposed to be doing on these 49 days. And then after 49 days, we get to Shavuot, we get to Torah, we get to that enlightenment that is beyond our regular understanding. Eliane.
Okay, so two things, something sparked in me. When
Some
we're
number
talking,
of things, somewhere between 1 and 49.
yeah. So I would love to get some resources on that for when I'm counting the Yom this year to study. But as we're talking about this in the 49 days, and then the 50th, I subscribe to the My Jewish Learning Daf Yomi, and today's was about counting the Omer and what you do with Shabbat, and does that become 50 days?
Oh, great. If there's something there you could share to the WhatsApp group, that would be great. I know I'd love to see that, and perhaps others would
Okay.
as well.
I think Lori's nodding her head. I think do you get it too? Yeah, I will
Great. And was
share.
there super? Great. All right. So I'm going to keep going here. So now it is taught that the patriarchs fulfilled the Torah before it was given. Oh, sorry, Anastasia, you've got your hand up. Or maybe you don't. I think you're on a train, so I'm going to assume that was a tech.
Yes.
Oh, no. Okay,
No, no,
please.
no. I just have a question. It's a little bit back further, but can you tell me what the skipping is about? I've never heard that referred to before.
We're going to, yes, but not now. I'm going to put a note in
Okay.
that to put in the notes.
Right.
Just
Thank
so I
you.
want to make sure to get through the next paragraph in the next 9 minutes. All right. So, it is taught that the patriarchs fulfilled the Torah before it was given. Jacob affected to fill in through the setting out of sticks and so forth. That means that they fulfilled the inner Torah through different acts of worship, less constricted than the Torah is for us, filled with restrictions and measures. Right? This is key precedence. The patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, were loyal servants of God. They worshiped Hashem. They did not, however, have any of the Torah that we have. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob precede the Torah in chronology, right? So you might say, okay, wait a minute. How can this be? How can it be that Abraham Avinu, Abraham our father, the progenitor of Judaism, didn't keep kosher, right? In fact, we have explicitly in the text, Abraham tells Sarah, we've got guests coming, go make some milk and meat. How could it be that Jacob didn't put on tefillin, the black boxes in the morning? And so one of the ways it's understood is they just understood this naturally from the world, right? When he says Jacob laid sticks, set out sticks, he's saying the point isn't the tefillin. The tefillin is a tool, and they just did this with different tools, right? Don't confuse the tool with the goal. We talked last week about don't try to eat the cookbook. It's useful to have a cookbook, but you can't try to eat it. A lot of Hasidus is reminding us that we have cookbooks, but we can't eat them. We have to do something with them. Right? So this is the meaning of the wise child's question. He's saying the wise child is coming with that expansiveness, like Jacob. Jacob didn't have to worry about like, is my black box exactly the right block, and am I tying the knots in exactly the right way? Jacob was not such a German Yekka with my wife's family, so German Yekkas are high on my mind. Right? They're saying Jacob was a little more chill. Jacob would like put out some sticks and he connected to God, and it was all good. And so the wise child is saying, what are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments? Right? It's not a question of what are they, it's what is this? Chill, chill, right? He experiences himself as in Godlut, having this expanded mind. So from here, he objects. What are these testimonies and statutes? Why is the Torah so constricted into rules and regulations commanded by God? It should be possible to fulfill the inward Torah through other acts of devotion, just as our ancestors did before the Torah was given. This is Mochin de Gadlut. The wise child has this expanded consciousness. The wise child sees himself already at that 50th gate. He's like, I am ready to receive the divine presence right now. Why are you bothering me with the blowtorch in the oven. I don't want the blowtorch in the oven. I want the divine presence flowing through me, right? This is a very common mindset, right? The largest group of, for millennials in America, the largest religious affiliation is spiritual, but not religious. These are those folks, right? The folks saying, I say this without hostility, right? It makes a lot of sense. I am in this expanded state. Why all of this uptightness? Now he gives his answer. Now this is this is what the Pri Chaim has been leading to this whole time. You have to answer the child by laying out the full practice of Pesach. Explain fully the reason why it's called Pesach, because of that great enlightenment that took place without the prior Katnut stages. There's that miracle back then. And that's why it's called Ein Maftirin. You can't be released from the obligation of carrying out all of the commandments and statutes that Yud-Hey Vav-Hey has given us in such constricted form. I'm sorry, but you got to get in the oven with the blowtorch. For those who don't know what I'm talking about, if you're really, really, really intense about making sure that there's no chametz in your kitchen or Passover, you're going to get a blowtorch in your oven to make sure there's not a little crumb hiding out somewhere. Okay? But you go on to say, after the Pesach comes Afikomen, namely the taking away of that first great revelation of expanded consciousness. Afika in Aramaic means going out or removal of the manna or the bread that comes out from heaven. Right after Pesach, this is taken away from us, and we enter the stages of Katnut, needing to fulfill the commandments in their present constricted state. So let me jump back to a different metaphor, the running metaphor. Okay? For the wise child who comes and says, I've got it. I am ready for that divine download, that download of divine energy right now. The Pri Chaim, and this is obviously anachronistic, sees that person as somebody who just watched the Olympics. And it's like, yeah, I just saw Usain Bolt, or what's that other guy? Noah Weil. But I just saw Usain Bolt run incredibly fast. I've got that. I can feel it. I can feel it in my bones. I'm ready to take off like that. And in fact, in that one moment of Pesach, whether it was the splitting of the sea or Sinai, there was a moment when we, the Jewish people, had the capacity to do the spiritual equivalent of, yes, I'm ready to go out and run a 2-hour marathon right now. I've got that mochin de gadlut, or the runner's equivalent of mochin de gadlut. I've got that incredible expanded capacity, but it disappears. And then we're back to being regular people. And I got to go out and grind my way through my half-hour 5K in the hopes that one day I could get to a marathon in under 4 hours, right? There was a moment when I could just hit it. There was a moment where I had that divine presence, but that moment doesn't last, right? Let me move this into one other arena, and then I apologize. I'm going to have to end somewhat abruptly here, but this is why we've got the WhatsApp for further questions and conversations. Perhaps us on this call have more experience in relationships than in being Olympic runners. And part of what he's describing, and you can see where this metaphor works for me, is the difference between love and marriage. You have that moment with your partner where you fall in love, where it's just that most incredible feeling, that orgasmic rainbows, unicorns, incredible feeling. And that feeling is real. It really is real, but it doesn't last for 60 years. All right. Well, I'll defer to some folks on this call. I know in my experience, it doesn't last for 25 years. That doesn't mean it's a failure. It's not a failure. You just can't stay there for 25 years. You then have to come back to, can I listen to you with respect? Can I articulate my needs clearly? Can I be pliable on my demands? Right? Milking the gadlut, I love you and you're amazing, and there are rainbows coming out of your eyeballs. Milking the katnut, how do we work together to do the dentist appointments and the vacation and the mortgage and all of that mochin the katnut stuff, because we're not always here. The Israelites, for one moment, were here, and now the rest of the time, we're koshering our kitchen in the hopes of getting back there. All right, I'm going to stop there. I apologize that we don't have time for questions now, just I've got a call right now at 1. But I will send some resources to everyone by email later when I send this recording around. Please, by all means, take advantage of the WhatsApp group. Better for questions there so we can all be hearing from each other. And more next week. All right. Thank you
Bye,
all.
everybody.
More soon.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you.